Okay, so again, today we're going to be focusing on housing, and in just a moment, I'm going to review master leasing versus rental assistance. Then one of my colleagues will discuss fair market rent and rent reasonableness. And after that, we're going to be focusing on several different topics, including participant rent contribution calculations, lease restrictions, including the Violence Against Women Act, and finally, housing quality standards. So as much as possible, we'll pause for questions and highlight where you can seek out additional resources. As a reminder, this is specific to CoC funding rules and regulations. So if your program does not receive CoC funding, this material will likely not apply to you. And again, this is really a primer, so we can't cover everything today, but we're going to the extent possible, lay out all the basics and point out additional resources and support networks. Okay, next slide, please. So we're going to start off with a basic survey of leasing and rental assistance, and specifically how they differ. So leasing and rental assistance are just two types of funding that you may have in a CoC grant budget. They're used for the same thing, to pay for the cost or provide housing for people who participate in CoC funded programs. But for the most part, you're going to have leasing, or you're going to have rental assistance in your program. If you're working with a joint transitional housing, rapid rehousing project model, you might have both leasing and rental assistance, but they would be used separately in separate parts of your project. There are different types of funding, and we're going to go into some of the ways in which the rules for the two different types of funding differ. So next slide, please. So one of the ways to think about the difference between the two is leasing dollars are much more tied to housing and the structure of a unit, while rental assistance dollars tend to be more about helping a person pay rent. So the structure of leasing is always going to look pretty much the same. There's a lease between the grant recipient, so the provider or the project operator, and the landlord. So the program is actually master leasing the unit. And then, of course, the tenant or the program participant has a sublease or perhaps an occupancy agreement, depending on the type of project they have enrolled in. So on the other hand, rental assistance can vary more in terms of its structure. There are three types of rental assistance that are available to a CoC program. There's tenant-based rental assistance, project-based, and sponsor-based rental assistance. We're not really going to talk about sponsor-based rental assistance today because I don't believe we currently have any sponsor-based rental assistance in the Santa Clara CoC portfolio. But I'm going to talk a little bit about tenant-based rental assistance, or TBRA, and project-based rental assistance. So in both of these models, there's a lease between the program participant, the client, and the landlord directly. There will be some sort of rent payment contract between the grant recipient and the landlord, but there will always be that direct lease that the tenant has for that unit with the landlord under rental assistance. So next slide, please. So for each of these types of funding, there are also caps on the cost of a unit. So this is distinct from how much you can spend with this funding. It's more a matter of how expensive a unit can be when you're using these funds. So when you're looking at the overall cost of a unit for a leasing project, you can pay up to fair market rent with leasing dollars, but you cannot pay more than fair market rent, and you cannot go over rent reasonableness. For leasing, if you find a unit where the rent is reasonable, but the rent is above FMR, you cannot use leasing funds to pay up to FMR for that unit. You have to find a unit where you're paying just rent reasonableness. For rental assistance, on the other hand, you can pay more than fair market rent with your CoC funding. You just cannot pay something that is above rent reasonableness. So if you find a unit which you may in your area which is over FMR, but it is definitely reasonable for that area because all the units available in the area are over FMR, you can use rental assistance to pay for the upper limit of what is reasonable in that area. One slight difference between leasing and rental assistance is rental assistance can be more flexible, But you have to really watch out about your rental assistance budget, because if you only receive fair market rent per unit from HUD and you're paying above fair market rent per unit from HUD, then you're going to have to find a place in your budget to get that additional funding. Next slide, please. So this next slide here gives us some more information about what exactly you can pay for. So clearly, you can pay for the rent. On a leasing project, you're paying the rent on the lease that the project has, that you as a provider have. And then for rental assistance, you're paying some portion of the rent that the client is responsible for paying to the landlord. So in addition to paying rent, both leasing and rental assistance have some other eligible expenses. So under both leasing and rental assistance, you can pay for a security deposit that is equal in amount up to 2 months' rent. And you can also cover the first and last month's rent upfront. So for both leasing and rental assistance, you can also pay for what HUD refers to as the costs of carrying out those eligible activities. So the staff costs, in other words, including your staff's time spent cutting checks, processing rent payments, or completing housing quality standards, inspections of units that your clients are considering. There's a general set of staff costs that are necessary for the release of rental assistance funds. And sometimes we get questions about whether something is considered a cost of carrying out an activity that you can use your rental assistance funds on. So if you have specific questions like that, you should always feel free to email us with those specific questions. You could just ask us, is this cost eligible under rental assistance, or could I bill it towards something else? Another difference between rental assistance and leasing is you can use rental assistance funds to pay for property damage to the unit. You can do that for up to 1 time per participant. It would have to be at a point when the client is leaving a unit and the landlord has assessed that there are damage costs that are greater than the security deposit. So in that situation, again, just once per participant, you can use rental assistance funding if you have it in your budget to pay for property damages up to an amount equaling 1 month's rent. If you don't have eligible costs under leasing dollars, again, you don't have eligible costs under leasing dollars, so you can't use leasing funds to pay for damages. So that's a key distinction there. And that's because if you have a leasing line item in your budget, you also have the option to ask HUD for an operating line item, and the operating line item does have some ability to pay for damage to the unit you're leasing if those damages aren't the responsibility of the landlord or covered in the security deposit. And so the difference is that those damages would come out of rental assistance for a rental assistance project. Okay, next slide. So when HUD talks about housing costs, HUD considers the entire cost of housing to be rent plus utilities. Both leasing and rental assistance are intended to include the entire housing cost of a unit. So again, that's rent and utilities together. For a leasing program, if utilities are included in your rent, if your program has a lease with the landlord and the utilities are included in that lease and they are paid by the landlord and you just pay rent, then of course you're using your leasing funds to pay for that because you're using your leasing funds to pay for rent. If your rent and your lease does not include utilities, you cannot use your leasing funds to cover the cost of utilities. But if you have an operating line item, you can use your operating funds to pay for utilities. When you're applying for a grant, you do have the option of asking for that operating line item. If you're operating a leasing program, you have the option of asking clients to pay rent. And if you're having all of your participants pay rent, then you're going to factor in the cost of utilities to the rent payments. For rental assistance, you have to factor in the cost of utilities of any utilities participants are paying for separately from their rent. So if that participant has a lease with the landlord and utilities are covered in their rent, then you will help them pay their rent to whatever extent is appropriate. If there are utilities that are not included in the rent and the participant is responsible for paying for them, then again, you have to factor that into the total cost of housing. And we're going to walk through more about what that means when we talk about calculating the client's share of the rent. But essentially, it means that you have to consider utilities that the client is paying for outside of their costs when you're determining how much rent the client should be paying. Okay, next slide. So this slide here takes us through an area where we do tend to get a lot of questions, and that's vacancy payments. So what happens when I'm assisting a client in a unit and that client vacates the unit before the end of their lease? So for example, a client in permanent housing may enter a residential treatment program, or a client may end up incarcerated. And if that time in an institutional setting is going to exceed 90 days, then that is considered a vacancy. So in a leasing program, because the program has a lease with the landlord, the lease is for a particular term. Maybe it's for 1 year. And you're obligated to abide by the terms of that lease. You have to pay that rent for a 1-year term. So if the client vacates the unit in the middle of the lease, say 6 months in, for example, you cannot break your lease with the landlord unless there's a lease provision that specifically says that the lease ends when the tenant moves out. You still have the lease and you're responsible for paying it, again, unless you have that type of provision. So if you're responsible for paying it, you can use CoC funding to continue to pay the rent for that unit until the lease comes to its natural end. So rental assistance is a little different. Because it's not the program that has the lease, it's the client directly. If the client vacates the unit, then you can continue making payments on that unit. You can continue supporting the rent for up to 30 days after the end of the month in which the client vacates. So for example, if the client moves out of a unit for whatever reason on April 20th, then you've likely already paid the rent for April, and you can pay the rent for May on that vacant unit, which may give you a little time to get another client into that unit, or to potentially try to work with the client who vacated the unit to come back if you happen to still be in touch with the client and that's something that they're interested in. If that's the case, then you do have some flexibility, but there is a limit, and you can only pay for up to 1 additional month, and that would be the month after the month in which the client vacates the unit. Okay, next slide, please. So finally, I want to point out some things just to watch out for when you're thinking about planning for these funds. So for leasing, you cannot lease a unit that your agency owns. So generally speaking, you cannot pay rent to yourself for a unit that you own, or that's owned by your parent organization, or by a subrecipient of these grant funds. Bottom line, HUD doesn't want you to pay rent to yourself, except if you can tell HUD, hey, I own this unit, but I want to pay myself rent, and I have a really good reason to do that. And if you can convince them that there is a good reason, then in theory, you can get HUD's permission to do that. And then on the other side, there's rental assistance. And I just want to note that it's actually pretty common for rental assistance projects to have rental assistance funding that's left over. And this is primarily because HUD funds your grants at the amount of fair market rent for each unit in your grant agreement. So for most non-rapid rehousing assistance projects that use rental assistance, for most other projects, you do have to assess the client's income and then charge them rent. So for every client that has an income of more than $0, they're actually going to pay some portion of their income in their unit costs. So you're getting paid the full FMR, but because the client is paying some portion of the rent, if they have more than $0 in income, you may actually be paying out less than FMR per unit, depending on the cost of the unit. So that's just one thing to think about. So that extra bit of funding that you may have per unit can be used to potentially pay more than FMR for some units if you cannot find a lower cost unit. In some cases, that may be used to cover the staff cost of administering rental assistance. So you might put that toward your HQS inspections and your staff time for doing things like cutting checks. I just noticed that we have a question come up. Is there a minimum a client needs to pay even at zero income?
It's a great question. And the answer is no. If a client has zero income, and we'll go through some pieces of how to calculate the client contribution to rent later in the training, but the short answer is no. If a client has zero income, then they will be paying zero portion of the rent.
Yeah, thanks, Eli, and thanks for the question. And I know also that this is a lot to absorb, so let's have a little quiz here. So let's do a little hypothetical just to practice some of what we've just been discussing and practice how to apply it. And with these kinds of hypotheticals, don't worry if you don't know the correct answer. The point is just to make this a little more interactive to get you begin to thinking about this. So in our scenario, let's say you operate a leasing program and you have a tenant who exited their CoC funded unit, which was funded through your leasing dollars. So the recipient's lease, that is the program's lease with the landlord, ends automatically after 6 months of vacancy. So the question is, how long can the program continue to use CoC program leasing funds to pay for this vacant unit? So we're going to throw up a poll question here. So you should be able to see that the poll question has launched. So you have, again, a leasing program. You have a lease with the landlord, and it ends automatically after 6 months of vacancy, and you have a vacant unit. How long can you keep your leasing funds to fund that unit while it is vacant? So your choices are until the end of the month that the client exited, until the lease ends 6 months after the client exits, or CoC leasing funds cannot be used to pay for vacant units. So we're just going to take another moment or so for folks to give it a shot. Okay, just a few more seconds. Okay, we're at more than 3/4 of participation, so that's great. Okay, so we have a little bit of a range in terms of responses. So the correct answer here is until the lease ends 6 months after the client exits. And that is because with leasing, you're responsible for abiding by the terms of your lease. And under the terms of your lease, the lease doesn't end until 6 months after the vacancy. So you're both allowed and obligated to pay for the vacancy for that period. The leasing rule is really close to the rule for rental assistance. The rule for rental assistance is until the end of the month after the client exited. So thank you so much for participating in that poll. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to one of my colleagues who is going to talk about FMR and rent reasonableness.
Thanks, Kyle. So there are two ways a program can determine rent. You can look to fair market rent, FMR, or rent reasonableness, two concepts Kyle's already referenced. And we're going to start this section with the definitions for both, and then we'll cover when you might look to one over the other to determine rent limits. So we'll start with FMR. In order to ensure a reasonable supply of adequate rental housing is accessible to participants, HUD established an estimate of gross rent that includes both rent and utilities, but excludes telephone, internet, satellite, and cable fees. We also want to note that FMR numbers are published annually and published on the website, on HUD's website on October 1st. Next slide, please. So HUD's website provides FMRs for many years. So it's really important, and you're going to want to make sure that you're using the correct FMRs for your project. And you'll need to know your project's start and end date. So for example, if your project has a start date of September 1st, 2020, then you should use the 2020 FMR numbers until the end of that project, which would be August 31st, 2021. And on this slide, you can see the FMR numbers are broken down by number of bedrooms. We're now going to move on to talking about the definition of rent reasonableness. So rent reasonableness, as the name would suggest, aims to ensure that rents paid are reasonable in relation to rents being charged for comparable unassisted units in the same market. And when you're comparing rents paid for unassisted units, you're looking for units that are in a similar location, of a similar size, type, quality, and age that offer similar amenities and utilities. And we'll go through this a bit more in detail in a few slides. So now we're going to go over whether you'd look to FMR or rent reasonableness to determine capped limits. So for leasing a unit, you are capped at whichever is the lower of the two. So whichever is the lower of FMR or reasonable rent. This means you can never exceed either. For leasing a unit, you're capped at rent reasonableness. Now for rental assistance, you can exceed FMR, but you're capped at rent reasonableness. We want to note that if the recipient pays rent beyond FMR levels for some units in a project, they must ensure that they have sufficient funding, either through program participant rent contributions or lower rents in other areas of the community, to serve the contracted number of program participants for the remainder of the grant term. Next slide, please. So we're just going to take a pause for a quick comprehension check based on that slide, and look at these the one bedroom unit column. And in this case, the reasonable rent is determined to be $850, and the FMR is $775. And we want to think through what the allowable rent payment for this one bedroom unit is. So we want to think back to what those rent caps are for leasing projects. I'm going to launch a poll right now. So would the allowable rent payment be $850 or $775? Great, I'm already seeing answers trickle in. I'll wait till we're at least just a bit above 50%. Great, okay. I'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll. So I'm seeing mixed answers. And for this, we want to remind ourselves that for lease units, we're capped at the lower amount of the two. So in this instance, the FMR was the lower amount. And this means that the recipient can only spend up to $775 out of its CoC leasing budget. That $75 difference between $850 and $775 can be paid from other resources, however. We're going to move on to our second example, and we're looking at rental assistance projects this time. And so for this second comprehension check, we're thinking about rent limits for rental assistance projects within this 2-bedroom unit column. So the reasonable rent is $1,325, and the FMR is $1,400. So it's the same question of what is the allowable rent payment. And let's launch our second poll. So would the allowable rent payment be $1,325 or $1,400? And we're now looking at rental assistance projects, which they're different from leasing projects, so keep that in mind. Okay, I'll give it just a couple more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. So most people said $1,325. Yes, so we want to remind ourselves that for rental assistance units, you can exceed FMR, but you're always capped at rent reasonableness. We also want to just underscore that unlike leasing programs, which can use non-CoC funds to cover the balance between the rent and FMR or rent reasonableness, rental assistance programs are prohibited from subsidizing units that exceed rent reasonableness. Okay, next slide, please. So with this slide, it's just a couple of reminders that FMR numbers are published online by HUD for corresponding geographic areas, and they're updated annually. So again, make sure you're using the FMR for the year that corresponds to your grant start and end date. And with rent reasonableness, this is determined by recipients and subrecipients. And when you really want to consider gross rent. So you're looking at rent and utilities, and you want to look at location, quality, size, type, age, as well as amenity and utility offerings. Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, with rent reasonableness, recipients and subrecipients are responsible for determining what documentation is required to ensure that the rent reasonableness standard is met for each unit. They're responsible for maintaining that documentation and including supporting evidence for every assisted unit in client files, and for ensuring that the comparisons and the comparable rents that are being used are up to date and appropriate for each year. So it's best practice to update comparable units being used for review on an annual basis, as we know that rents fluctuate on the market. It's also, I just want to pause here and note that it's important that rent reasonableness reviews are conducted for all units prior to executing a lease. Failing to do so means you will have to terminate the lease and work to find a rent reasonable unit. After terminating it, this is more cumbersome than you just following a rent reasonableness process to begin with. In addition, there's a financial liability that now enters, but we also just want to think back to, we're trying to minimize disruptions for our clients. So we want to avoid having to displace them and then now having to relocate them. So that's why it's really important that we're making sure we're following a rent reasonableness process. And we're going to go over the steps to ensure compliance shortly. Next slide, please. So what are some examples of how you can document rent reasonableness? you can conduct a market study. Market studies can determine the value of certain features and what drives rent. We want to note that market studies of rent tend to focus on particular housing types, and they often don't include utilities, which we know should be included when we're doing our rent reasonableness reviews. Another acceptable method is a review of advertisements for comparable units. So you can print out 3 comparable units with evidence of similar feature offerings, or you can obtain written verification from a property owner that confirms that the rent is comparable to that of which they charge for similar unassisted units. Next slide, please. So recipients and subrecipients must establish written policies and procedures for documenting rent reasonableness. This includes a methodology for documenting comparable rents, the case file checklists and forms that should be included, standards for certifying comparable rents as reasonable, staffing assignments, as well as strategies for addressing special circumstances. Next slide. So a uniform approach to rent reasonableness across the community reduces barriers to housing for program participants. So providers should adopt the rent reasonableness policy that's listed on the CoC website. And this policy lays out the purpose of a rent reasonableness standard, as well as the necessary steps that must be taken to determine whether a unit meets the standard. Next slide. Because FMR includes utilities in its estimate, we want to note that rent reasonableness must consider the entire housing cost that, according to the lease, is the responsibility of the tenant. So according to the CoC policy, utility costs that are include gas, electric, water, sewer, and trash. And telephone, television service, and internet service should be excluded. We also want to note that fees that are accrued through the failure to pay in a timely fashion should also be excluded. Next slide, please. So the policy as listed on the CoC website notes that when documenting rent reasonableness, no less than 3 comparable units should be included in this review. And the units that you're using for the comparison must be up to date. And you can compare the rents either through a market study of rents. And when pursuing this approach, we would encourage you to consider looking to agencies that collect and aggregate data that often publish market studies of their own. So this can include the Public Housing Authority, the Chamber of Commerce, or commercial real estate firms. Another acceptable method is obtaining that written verification that's signed by the property owner or a management company, again, confirming that they have similar market rate units that are currently rented at comparable rates, or those 3, at least 3 comparable units by reviewing advertisements as well. You just want to make sure that you're including the supporting evidence within the client files. Next slide, please. So there's going to be a little bit of repetition, but as I mentioned, when looking at comparable units, there are 3 most important factors in explaining differences in rent are location of the unit, number of bedrooms in the unit, and the type of unit. And as I said, we're looking at these following features when looking at similar units. So in a similar location, we don't want to be comparing units that are in San Jose and in Mountain View. We want them to be in a similar location. When we're thinking about similar size, type, quality, and age, with size, we don't want to be just simply thinking, oh, okay, I'm going to compare a studio with an SRO. Those are both very different types of housing, so we want to be mindful of that. We're going to be thinking about housing condition. Is it in good condition? Is it in fair condition? That's kind of expected for the age of the unit. And then we're thinking about similar amenities and utilities. So we're thinking about amenities within the unit, on site within the building, larger public amenities in the neighborhood. We're thinking about accessibility, and then we're thinking about those utilities that are included. Next slide, please. We want to acknowledge that—
Actually, sorry, Nicole, I want to, for the in like similar location, just to put an even finer point on that, the San Jose is a big city in itself, right? And not all units within San Jose are in similar locations. Some of them are very far away from each other. Some of them are in very different neighborhoods. So for example, you wouldn't want to compare units that are somewhere, up in North San Jose to units in Mayfair to units in Campbell, right? So it's really at a pretty granular level that we're looking at similar locations. Sorry about that.
No worries. Thanks, Eli. So we're going to build on what Eli just mentioned in this slide, where one, we want to recognize that in an ideal world, we'd find 3 units that are super comparable on every level. But in some cases, it's going to be hard to identify units that match perfectly on location, building type, and number of bedrooms. So in those instances, it's best practice, and we encourage to try and locate units that have the same number of bedrooms and building type, but are in a broader geographic range. And this is where we want to just take a pause and kind of add a little bit of nuance to what we're talking about when we're thinking about similar location and geographic range. So with this, we want to be mindful of not being too limiting, but also too expansive in our interpretation of geographic range. So we don't want to limit it to, oh, I'm thinking about similar location, it has to be within 3 miles. That's where I'm limiting my radius. But we also, again, don't want to be comparing units, even if they are within the same city, that have very different amenity offerings. And so when we're thinking about proximity, we're thinking about similar access to services like bus lines, grocery stores, larger public amenities. And so rather than think about mile radiuses or zip codes, what can be really helpful is thinking about geographic ranges that are within the same school boundaries, because that can be a helpful way of thinking through how that can be aggregated. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, it is the recipient and subrecipient's responsibility to So as I mentioned earlier, it is the recipient and subrecipient's responsibility to determine a rent reasonableness standard. And the CoC has set the standard to be within $100. So this means that only unit rents that are no more than $100 above the average of the 3 comparable units will be considered rent reasonable. Next slide. And I think this is going to get to your question as well. So there is a user guide on the CoC website that walks you through how to fill out this checklist. And as you'll note on this slide, you would fill it out for a proposed unit, and then you're filling out the 3 comparable units, you're listing and looking at number of bedrooms, the size, the type, the amenities that are offered. And then you want to note that sections A through C at the bottom, you're noting the FMR for the proposed unit size, and you're going to want to be mindful of, is this a leasing unit? Is this a rental assistance unit? And then think back to where rent limits are capped for each. So with leasing units, you want to be mindful of that. And then another thing I'll note with this list is when you're adding up comparable units, you want to make sure you're using the total gross rents. Something we see often is people will add up the row of unit rents and divide by 3. We really want to make sure that we're factoring in those utility costs for that. And then with section C, that's where we're determining, okay, Was this average gross rent within that $100 standard that the CoC has set? If it is, we can go ahead with the unit. It's rent reasonable. Is there another? Okay, great. Happy to hear that that clarified that. So we're at the end of this section. I want to take a pause just to see if there are other questions. If not, we do have one last poll for this section. Maybe we don't. I'll just pause for questions then.
I do have a question. I was trying to type it out, but it's kind of long. But I think I'll just talk it through. So if you have a 6-bedroom rental, and then you, one of the tenants is renting one of the rooms of the 6-bedroom house. So to do a rent reasonable, how to do it, to compare it the best possible way, would you try to find 3 other house rentals with 5 bedrooms, or the most I can find, or 4 bedrooms, and then divide it by that number to, I don't know, I'm just trying to figure out. I don't know. I did have a case where I had a 7-bedroom house. Somebody was renting a room.
So shared housing.
In a 7-bedroom house, but I mean, I didn't actually do the case. I just review the file. So the housing specialist, what they did was they just found like 3. They couldn't find a 7-bedroom house to compare with. So what they did was they just found like a 2-bedroom condo, a 2-bedroom apartment, a 3-bedroom house, and then those were actually like a single room occupancy, like they were just renting one room in that house, or one room, I'm sorry, in the condo, and that's how they did it.
So we do have some guidance and resources that can help think through how you would conduct rent reasonableness for shared housing situations. For the sake of time, I'll just provide a brief answer to this, but then we can definitely follow up and I can send you those materials. So with shared housing situations, you would try to look for the same, those like same feature offerings, the same size, the same amount of bedrooms, but it's also, you'd want to look at listings for other shared housing units. So where it is, okay, this person is paying this much for this room of a similar size. But I know that that's not really getting to all of the nuance and details of that question, but just recognizing that we have a lot more content to cover. I will follow up with you and share those resources with you and anyone else. We can share it to all of the attendees in case that's relevant and helpful.
Okay. So wait, really quick, the SRO, that's single room occupancy or shared room? I don't know, I've heard different things. So
Single room.
Yeah, so and an SRO,
not a shared room occupancy, it's really a single room occupancy.
Right, an SRO is a unit that is designed, it's like, think of a dorm situation or a residential hotel, where it's a room that may or may not have its own bathroom, may or may not have, it probably doesn't have any kitchen facilities, and the those things might be shared. Whereas, and it would be sort of in a you're on a hall in an apartment style building. Whereas a shared housing situation is, it's a multi-room apartment, a multi-room house, and you're renting just the bedroom portion. So it's not, those aren't two housing situations we want to be comparing. But great question.
So, okay, so single room occupancy, so that's more like a hotel situation, or it's not like they're sharing a room, right? Okay. All right, thank you for that clarification.
Nicole, I wonder if so I see the question from Laura. I wonder if we might get to this question as we walk through the rent reasonableness activity.
I think
and
so.
then Laura, let us know if your question hasn't been answered by the end of it.
Yeah, I think putting it into practice through the activity that Kyle will walk us through will be a good way of reinforcing some of these concepts. So I'll hand it over to Kyle.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole, for that great overview. So now we're going to complete a little activity that will help us hone our understanding of rent reasonableness. And if any questions do come up during our activity, please do go ahead and enter them into the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them as they come in. Okay, next slide, please. So to kick things off, let's return to our to the rent reasonableness checklist and certification that Nicole introduced to us. Yeah, there we go. So this form is available on the Santa Clara County CoC website under Program Management CoC Forms. Also on the webpage, there's a one-page user guide for this form to help explain all the various units in the form. But for now, we're going to focus on the upper half, which helps us compare the proposed unit, so the unit that your client would like to rent, with 3 comparable units. And as Nicole mentioned, you'll compare them based on characteristics like the number of bedrooms, the type of unit, for example, if it's a single family home or an apartment, the condition of the building, and any utilities or amenities that are included. So next slide, please. So here's our proposed unit. So I'll remind you of the details on subsequent slides. So don't feel as if you need to take notes on the unit details or take a screenshot. Our proposed unit is a 2-bedroom apartment in Gilroy. It is 600 square feet. It's in a high-rise building that was built in 1990, and it's in good condition. Amenities include laundry in the building, new appliances, proximity to public transportation, and ADA accessibility. Finally, we have gas utilities that are included in the rent. So now the details from our proposed unit are going to pop up in subsequent slides in the little red box in the lower right-hand corner. And as we look at other units, just consider whether other units are comparable to the proposed unit right here. Okay, so the first unit we're going to consider is a 2-bedroom apartment in Gilroy. It's 630 square feet. It's in a low-rise building that was built in 1987, and it's in good condition. Amenities include laundry in the building, new appliances, proximity to public transit, ADA accessibility, and gas utilities are also included with the rent. So now we are going to launch a poll that asks you whether Unit 1 seems comparable to the proposed unit that the client would like to rent. So as a reminder, we have the little red box in the lower right-hand corner, which details the proposed unit. So I'll give you some time to let us know whether Unit 1 seems comparable to the proposed unit. You might want to consider the number of bedrooms, the location, square footage, age, condition, amenities, and utilities. We'll give it just a few more seconds for responses to come in. Really love the participation rate. Just a couple more seconds. And okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop us there. So great job. Yes, Unit 1 does seem comparable for the purposes of our comparison. It has the same number of bedrooms. It's pretty similar in terms of size and age. It has similar utilities and amenities. So now let's look at our second option. So the second unit for our consideration is a studio apartment in Mountain View. It's 350 square feet, and it's in an in-law unit that was built in 1970, and it's in fair condition. It does not include laundry, and it is not ADA accessible. Gas utilities are also not included in the rent. So again, we have the box below to remind us of the details of the proposed unit. So we'll ask again, does Unit 2 seem comparable to the proposed unit? So let's have another little poll. And just a couple more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end our poll here. And there's really no fooling your folks here. So on balance, it seems like the unit would not be considered comparable. We're looking at different cities, different numbers of bedrooms, a studio versus a 2-bedroom unit. A pretty significant difference in size, 350 square feet versus 600, and differences in the amenities and utilities that are included. So it does seem on balance that unit 2 would not be considered comparable. We're going to move right along because, as we remember, for our rent reasonableness checklist and certification, we do need 3 comparable units. So right now we have 1 unit that is comparable and 1 unit that is not. So let's take a look at unit 3. So unit 3 is a 2-bedroom apartment in Gilroy. It's 550 square feet in a high-rise building built in 1980, and it's in good condition. The amenities include laundry in the building and new appliances. It's walking distance from community amenities and facilities such as a library and grocery store. It's also ADA accessible. And finally, gas utilities are included in the rent. So again, we're going to launch another little poll, and I'll ask again, does this unit seem comparable to the proposed unit? Oh, there we go. And as the responses come in, we'll just note that the comparison is going to become a little more difficult, and I just want to make a couple observations here. This can become quite challenging in real life. Sometimes it's more of an art than a science. So we're considering 2-bedroom units here, which are pretty common. If your client, for example, needed a 4 or 6-bedroom unit, you may need to look a little harder, possibly even in different cities, to find comparable units. Also, your client may have needs that are not reflected in the rent reasonableness chart, such as, if they have children that they'd like to keep in the same school district. So however your client's circumstances make unit comparable or not comparable, you'll want to document that in the client's file so that HUD can understand your thinking here. Okay, so I'm going to end this poll here. Okay, so on balance, unit 3 does seem comparable. It's a 2-bedroom unit in Gilroy. It's similar in size, 550 versus 600 square feet. It's in good condition and a high-rise building. It has similar amenities. However, we will note that walking distance to community-based resources versus transit, here that's probably not going to be a deal breaker for the client. But if you have a client who needs to take public transit to work, for example, that may mean that this unit is not comparable. But for the purposes of the exercise, we'll say that on balance, the unit is comparable. And just again, for much of the time, you can't look for the exact same unit. You may not be able to find 3 units that meet all of your criteria. What you're doing, what you're doing is weighing the significance of the differences. That's the important thing to keep in mind. We've been emphasizing the number of bedrooms because most people consider that to be a significant difference, such as a studio versus a 2-bedroom unit. And again, this can become a bit more challenging when you're looking for a unit type that's rare, such as a 6-bedroom unit. In that case, we may need to be more flexible because there may just not be many 6-bedroom units for us to compare in the relevant community. So we have 2 units that are comparable. We need to find 3, so let's take a look at unit 4. Unit 4 is a 3-bedroom apartment in Gilroy. It's 800 square feet in a high-rise building built in 2010 that is in good condition. Amenities include an in-unit laundry, new appliances, proximity to community locations. It's ADA accessible, and electric utilities are included in the rent. So I'll launch a poll here asking, does unit 4 seem comparable? We'll just take a few more seconds for folks to answer. Okay, so 3, 2, 1. All right. So for the purposes of this activity, the number of bedrooms, 3 bedrooms versus 2 bedrooms, that's a pretty significant difference. Also, it's a 800 square foot apartment versus a 600 square foot apartment. That's not an insignificant difference either. So I think for the purposes of this activity, we're going to lean toward no, the unit would not be comparable, largely based on the number of bedrooms, the size of the unit, the age of the unit. And with your indulgence, we're going to move on to Unit 5. Okay, so we're back to considering a 2-bedroom unit in Gilroy. It's 650 square feet. It was built in 1995 in a high-rise building that's in good condition. The amenities include laundry in the building, a balcony, proximity to transit, and ADA accessibility. Propane utilities are included. So we're going to do one more poll here. For our purposes, is Unit 5 comparable? And just a few more seconds. Let's see if we can get up to 50% participation. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Okay, so great job. Unit 5 does seem comparable. So we've identified 3 comparable units or 3 comparable units. We can return to our checklist and certification. So we're looking at the upper half of the rent reasonableness checklist from the CoC website. It's now filled in with the proposed unit and 3 comparable units. So you'll notice near the bottom of this form that we filled in the rent. We did not consider rent during the activity because, as we discussed earlier, we were considering units that are comparable in terms of size and type and amenities. So now we're moving into the second phase of our analysis, which considers whether the rent is reasonable as compared to these comparable units. So next slide, please.
And I think just pausing here, I think this might go at least in part to Laura's question. So you can see the unit rent is whatever is the monthly rent, right? And then you're going to figure out what the estimated utility allowance for that unit is, given what utilities are included in that rent and what aren't. And you're going to add them together to get the gross rent. Sorry, thanks.
No, thanks so much, Eli. Yeah, so let's now look at the lower half of the form. So Section A identifies the proposed rent for the proposed unit. Section B outlines the comparable units. And in Section C, we certify whether our rent is in fact rent reasonable. So as Nicole talked about earlier, the proposed unit's gross rent, which we calculated in Section A, must be within $100 of the average gross rent of comparable units in Section B. If that's the case, we'll sign the form to certify that the rent is reasonable. So here the proposed unit's gross rent as identified in Section A is $2,824. The average gross rent for the comparable units is $2,892. Since those amounts are within $100 of each other, we can certify that the rent is reasonable. So next slide. Okay, I know we went by that really quickly, but thank you so much for participating. We'll just pause here and see if anyone has any questions.
Just to speak to the question about maximum difference between square footage that wouldn't be considered comparable, I'd really just go back to what Kyle mentioned in terms of this is more of an art than a hard science. So while it would be helpful for us to have, like, when we're thinking about similar location, we're limiting it to this mile distance, or this is the square footage that is, acceptable. We don't have those hard limits. So a lot of this really will come down to using your best judgment and taking into account how similar the unit is in other ways, which we hope was kind of illustrated within that activity, but we recognize situations and cases when you're trying to find 3 comparable units will get really tricky. And so we're here as a resource. We really want to point you to the materials and guidance that talks about this a little more in detail on the CoC website. And also just want to underscore that, yes, in some cities and locations, finding those units may be incredibly difficult, but there are always those other approaches. So getting that written verification from a property owner that they are renting out units at similar rates, even within that building, that is one acceptable approach as well. So thanks, Kyle.
I just want to quickly ask a question. So when do you use the SRO rate? That's when they're renting a room, correct? You know, like the SRO,
Yeah.
or single room occupancy rate. So like when they're renting, there's, I think it's on the, I think I have to look up, I think it's on the utility allowance. There's an SRO rate.
Oh, okay. So are you asking specifically about when you would use an SRO utility allowance amount?
So like in order to be an SRO, when do you use the SRO calculation? That's only when a person is renting a room in a house or an apartment?
So my best answer is that you're going to look to like the SRO. There's going to be so many acronyms in the next things that I say, and I apologize. You're going to look to the SRO FMR, fair market rent rate. If you're looking, like if you're doing your fair market rent check, you're going to look at the SRO fair market rent rate when your client is renting what is technically an SRO. And that is not a room in a house. It's not a room in a multi-room apartment. It's a particular type of apartment unit that is very similar, like I mentioned before, very similar to a residential hotel room, like that we often call SROs residential hotels. It's an SRO, a unit that is designed, like it's a single contained unit. It's not a room in a multi-unit room, like in a house or a multi-room apartment. It's a single unit, and typically it may have its own bathroom, it may not, typically doesn't have full cooking facilities. So that is what an SRO is, and you only want to compare an SRO to an SRO. You only want to use the SRO fair market rent rate for an SRO. In terms of like the utility allowances, I'm pretty sure the same thing would apply. You're only going to use the SRO utility allowance for an SRO. So then the question is, what do you do for shared housing? What do you do for a room rental that is a room in a house and a room in an apartment?
Yeah.
And as Nicole pointed out, we have more guidance on that. And again, unfortunately, we don't have time built into this training to go into that in depth. But we can, Nicole, I think we can include in our follow-up email to this training that guidance and a little more like direction about, if you're thinking about shared housing, look here, and then feel free to email us always.
Yeah, I was just trying to get a better understanding, because I've seen a lot of different files, and I've seen like a trend where I feel like some, people are understanding when they're renting a room in a house or an apartment, like they're thinking that, oh, that is defined as an SRO. I think people are thinking that the concept is interchangeable, but it sounds like it really isn't. I think there's, you know what I mean? Like
absolutely, yeah. And thanks for calling out that confusion, because we really want to speak to it, especially if you're seeing that a lot. So, and an SRO and a shared room are treated differently. It's actually, an SRO is probably a lot easier to to figure out. Though, you know, shared housing is there's like, there are ways to, very clear ways, I think, to figure out the, you know, rent reasonableness and the FMR and everything. And I think a lot of the approach for shared housing is just going to be the pro rata, like you take, if it's a 6-bedroom house, you take the 6-bedroom FMR and you divide by 6. Or you take the 6-bedroom utility allowance and divide by 6. That's typically, but there's a lot more nuance there. Like I wouldn't just take that and
Right.
run with it every time. There's a lot more nuance, so we will send the additional guidance.
All right, great. Thank you for that. Thank you for answering my question.
Any other questions? Okay, not hearing any questions, we're going to go on to another, oh, no. Are you saying no, Nicole?
Sorry, that was for something else.
Okay, good. Because I'm really excited. This is a lot of sarcasm coming at you folks. I'm really excited to give you an overview of participant rent contribution calculations, because it's another area where there's just so much beautiful detail and lots of steps and a lot of information to remember. You know, we love that in our compliance, you know, just multi-step, lots of detail. So we're going to go over just the highlights of participant rent contribution calculation. At the end of this mini little presentation, I don't expect that you should be able to just go through a participant rent contribution calculation and get it right and completely understand it. That's not the level of training that we're going to be able to provide as part of this intro series. We're going to flag for you the pieces of this process, and then we're going to, again, follow up with more information and more detail about this. So just a reminder, we are here as resources for you, and also there are ways that we can provide additional support and training around these things. So what is a participant rent contribution? That's just the amount of rent that your client is going to be paying. How much are they contributing to the total rent? And then how much are you covering with your subsidy? So this is the typical, this is the sort of base HUD standard. This standard applies to permanent supportive housing and transitional housing projects. This base standard, this sort of very common HUD standard, applies to permanent supportive housing and transitional housing. So if you only work with rapid rehousing projects, know that this does not apply to you, and I'll get to you in a minute. But the general standard is for PSH and transitional housing, you're looking at 3 different possible ways of calculating the participant contribution to rent. Either 30% of the household's monthly adjusted income, 10% of the household's monthly gross income, or this third one, which is a little bit weird, portion of the household's welfare assistance, if any, that is designed for housing costs. So I'm just going to say this third one is not usually relevant. I would not recommend that you folks spend time trying to track down what this means. Typically, you're going to be looking at 30% of the household's adjusted income or 10% of the household's gross income. And we will be walking through what is adjusted, what is gross. For rental assistance projects, right? That rental assistance type of funding for either permanent supportive housing or transitional housing, you have to charge whichever of these is highest. You have to charge rent, and you have to charge whichever of these is highest. Now, if, as we mentioned before, if the client doesn't have any income, then 30% of their adjusted income is going to be zero, and 10% of their gross income is going to be zero, and you're going to charge them $0 as their client contribution. But if they have any income, then you need to go through this process that I'm going to give you an overview of to figure out what their income is, what their adjusted income is, and what their client portion of rent is. For leasing projects, if you get leasing dollars in your PSH or transitional housing, you don't have to charge rent or an occupancy charge. That's up to the project to choose. But if you do choose to charge rent or an occupancy charge, you have to do that for everyone. And you have to do it based on this calculation. So you can't charge more than this calculation if you choose to pay rent. You can't charge more than the highest fees. And then for rapid rehousing, there's a completely separate rule. As questions come up, please do put them in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on that. But as, if I don't see questions in the chat, I'm just going to keep pushing forward. So this is the standard. We haven't figured out, we haven't gone through yet about how you get here. How do you calculate this 30%? But at least we know this is the rule for PSH and transitional housing. But what is the rule for rapid rehousing? This is the client rent standard. HUD says, do what your CoC says. HUD says for rapid rehousing projects, the CoC has to write a policy. You don't have to follow the 30% of adjusted income or the 10% of gross, but the CoC does have to have a written policy that guides projects, and each project has to have their own written policy in place that aligns with the CoC, right? So HUD's not giving you the standard for how much rent to charge rapid rehousing clients, but the CoC has given a standard, and the projects for sure have to have your own way of like written process and procedure for figuring that out, and you need to follow it faithfully. Oops, slides are a little out of order. So in Santa Clara County, the Santa Clara County Continuum of Care has set up written standards. Great. And those written standards provide that, you know, rapid rehousing rental subsidies are provided for a maximum of 24 months. That complies with the CoC program rules. And those subsidies are going to decline over time. And the program has to set up a fixed timeline. So you have to start out with a standard, like at 3 months, we're going to step down, or every month we're going to step down this much. But you can revise that timeline as the client's circumstances change. So there's both, each program has to set up a fixed step down schedule by month, by 2 months, by 3 months, whatever. But then you really have to be looking at, are the client's circumstances the same? Have they lost their job? Do they have a medical emergency? Do we need to relax the step down? Do we need to go back up? And then the rest of the CoC written standards say that you can start out paying as much as 100% of rent. That's fine. And then the client, as the program assesses that their financial situation and family situation are allowing them to pay more rent, then the percentage of the rent that they pay is going to go up. This means specifically that your schedule for step down and your calculation of how much your rapid rehousing client is paying is not based on a percentage of the client's income. It's based on a percentage of the unit rent. So in Santa Clara County, rapid rehousing rent calculations are very different from our typical standard HUD rent calculation that we do for PSH and transitional housing. Are there any questions about that before I dive into that HUD process that is very different? All right, not hearing any questions. I want to make a last note about when you review rental amounts. And this applies to all of our project types. You want to be reviewing rental amount. For projects that receive leasing funds, you determine the amount of rent the client's going to pay initially. And then you don't have to change that on a regular basis. You don't have to reassess the client's income on a regular basis, but you do have to reassess the client's income if the client says, hey, reassess my income, my partner moved out, or my child who had income moved out, and my income is lower now. Or reassess my income, I lost my job, or I got a pay cut. The client is telling you that their income has changed. You should really reassess their income so they're not paying too much for their rent. For rental assistance, you're doing this assessment of what the client's income is and how much they should be paying in rent. You're doing that initially before you start assisting the unit, before you start paying, having them pay rent. And you're also doing that regularly. So annually, basically. And then you can do it on an interim basis, again, as the client's income changes. Specifically, if the client's income goes down, we really want to make sure we do this calculation again so that we're never overburdening the client with the rent payments. But the difference between a leasing project and a rental assistance project is that for rental assistance, you're required to do this assessment annually, at least. So now we're going to start a very quick run through of how do you do that HUD calculation of a client's income in order to figure out that 30% of adjusted income versus 10% of gross income. So rapid rehousing folks, the next several slides aren't particularly relevant to you, though it's always good to learn. We're lifelong learners. But for PSH and transitional housing projects, this is the process that you need to do. So as you are doing this calculation of the client's income and then figuring out their client portion of rent, you need to be relying on what HUD calls verified information. That just means that as much as possible, you want to obtain documentation to support each of the parts of your calculation of the client's rent, or of the client's income, and of the rent calculation. So you want to document in some way what the composition of the household is, what the anticipated income of each member of the household is, what the anticipated childcare or medical expenses are, the number of dependents. In some cases, you will be able to find external documentation of this in some way, particularly when it comes to anticipated income. In some cases, your documentation or verified income information may just be a statement from the client, but you need to be supporting your calculation in some way with some form of evidence. Specifically, verification or documentation of employment income, it's important to get third-party verification of that. Third-party means it's not you and it's not the client, it's someone else. And in this case, it would be the client's employer or potential future employer or new employer, right? This third-party verification of anticipated employment income can be the client's current pay stubs. It can be a letter from the employer. This is how much the client's gonna earn over the next few years, or over the next year, I mean, the anticipated annual income. But you do need that third-party documentation in some form. So now you're going through your steps, calculating the client rent. There are a lot of steps here, and we're going to condense some of them as we go through. You're not going to get all the detail. But step one is to determine how much income does the household have, just straight income. And then steps 2 through 6 are figuring out what kinds of deductions or allowances am I taking away from that income in order to get to the adjusted income. Because remember, we're going to end by comparing what's 10% of the gross income, the total unadjusted income, versus 30% of this adjusted income. And steps 2 through 6 are how you get to that adjusted income. And then we're going to determine which, what's our standard for rent, and then a utility allowance. So we'll walk through, for the most part, these steps in a general way. So step one, you figure out how much income is the client going to have. This is not, strictly speaking, how much income did the client have last year. It's a forward-looking thing. How much income does the client anticipate having over the next year? That can make the process a little bit gray sometimes, but you're going on the best evidence that you have. So what are the client's anticipated sources of income? Do they have a job right now? Do they expect to have that over the next year? They have it now and they haven't been fired yet. That's a fair expectation. Or does the client expect to be receiving benefits over the next year? Or does the client expect to have child support or alimony income over the next year? There are a lot of different types of income that human beings can have, and you're trying to assess the expected income from all types, all sources, any inflow. So to do that, you identify, well, who are the household members? Who's in our household? What do they expect to get over the next year? And then you're going to categorize this income as either included income or excluded income. So even here, right from the beginning, there's some types of income that we're going to ignore. We're not even putting that income as part of our gross income. We have a resource that we're going to share with you that is just included versus excluded income. It's a chart and it says these types of income are included, these types of income are excluded. We're not going to go over that right now because it's something that you can very easily read, and that if you have questions, contact home base. But that will be in the follow-up materials. And then you're going to record all of those sources of included and excluded income in whatever tool you're using. There's a rent calculation worksheet that we often share with folks, but I know some agencies have their own tools and forms that they would like folks to use. So whatever you're using, you're going to record, this is all of the income that my household anticipates. This is what is HUD said is included in gross income. This is what HUD said is excluded in gross income. So by the end of step one, you know the client's gross annual income. Quick quiz. If you aren't sure what types of income that your clients get should be included or excluded, what are some steps that you could take? And this poll should be set up so you can select one answer or you can select more than one answer. But what steps might you take if you're trying to do client income, client rent calculation, and you can't figure out what should be included or excluded? And I'll give maybe 3 more seconds for folks to check this out and participate. And we're going to close it down in 2, 1, and end polling. All right. Yeah, I love that we got a pretty significant percentage of y'all picking all 3 of them, because all 3 of these things are things that you might be able to do to figure out or to get more guidance on what types of income should be included versus excluded in gross client income or gross household income. We'll send out the what to include and exclude handout. You should have that. You can always talk to your team, your supervisor, your compliance staff, if there are folks around you who have more experience or may just be a good thought partner. And you can always, always, always email home base. You can check with your supervisor and have them email us. You can email us directly. We are here for you, each of you individually as human beings. So thank you, and excellent answers to that question. So we've done step 1 so far. We've figured out what is the gross income for this household, the total money coming in that is included according to HUD. The next steps 2 through 6, are to check for allowances. Allowances mean, in this situation, in this context, amounts that should be subtracted from the household's gross annual income because of certain allowances, certain deductions that HUD allows. And there are 5 types of allowances that a household may qualify for. They may qualify for one or more of these. And a very important part of the income and client rent contribution calculation is going through each of these allowances and checking whether your household qualifies. There's specific pieces of information that you need for each of these allowances. So does the household are there dependents in the household? Does the household need childcare specifically to allow another household member to pursue employment or education? Is there a client with a disability? Does the disability come with expenses that qualify? There's a lot of details that go into these. We'll also provide some slides in our follow-up that go through some of the more detailed information here. We're not going to do that today, but we really want to flag for you that part of this calculation is figuring out, does your household qualify for any of these allowances? And then making the deductions from their gross income as is appropriate. Because step 7 is to calculate your adjusted annual income for this client household. So step 1 was getting the gross income. Steps 2 through 6 was getting the allowances. Step 7 is getting the adjusted annual income. And to do that, you add together all of the allowances that your client qualifies for. If they don't qualify for an allowance, you're not going to include that. But if they do, then on all of the eligible allowances, you're going to add together those deductions that you need to make. And then you're going to subtract those adjustments, those deductions from the total gross income that you got in step 1. So you'll get the total gross income minus all the deductions that the client gets because of those allowances. That's your adjusted annual income. Hooray! We now have the 2 big numbers we need, right? We have the total income, the gross income, and we have the adjusted income. So the next step is to come back to this HUD standard for client portion of rent, which is especially if you're a rental assistance project, you have to charge rent and you're looking for the highest of either 30% of adjusted income or 10% of monthly gross income, or in some very, very rare, I have never seen it situations, the portion of the family's welfare assistance that is estimated for housing costs. So to get 30% of monthly adjusted income, you're going to get the monthly income first. You calculated annual income, so you have to divide it by 12 to get monthly income. And then you're going to check, 30% of adjusted compared to 10% of gross. Which one's higher? The highest one is your rent contribution for that client. Okay, another quick quiz. We're going to check steps of the process. So the question is, what's missing from this outline of the process? We have step 1, determine a household's annual income. And then we jump right to determining the amount of resident rent. What's missing in that middle step there? I'm going to throw up a poll. All right. So check out what the options in the poll. Just so you make a cup of tea. You can do steps 2 through 7, determining which allowances apply. You can visit the client at work, or you can email us. What's missing from this process? Gonna give folks a little bit more chance to take a look and to put in an answer. Just over 50% participation. So I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. There we go. All right. So the answer that I would pick, and the correct answer, is answer 2. We're missing steps 2 through 7, determining which allowances apply, because we can't figure out the amount of resident rent unless we know which allowances apply, and then subtract those allowances from our gross income to get our adjusted income, right? We can't even get to the step of comparing 30% of adjusted income to 10% of gross income until we have adjusted income. And to do that, we need to calculate the allowances. Making a cup of tea and emailing home base are totally acceptable things to do after step 1 of this process. Feel free. I mean, making a cup of tea is always appropriate. Email us if you have questions. Visiting the client at work is not a necessary part of this process. There are a lot of different ways that you can get documentation or verified third-party documentation of a client's anticipated income. If it's truly, truly necessary to visit a client at work and the client says, yes, please do that, I'm okay with it, I consent and I want you there, and there's no risk to me, maybe that's something that you'll need to do, but it is not a part of this process. It is not a required part of this process. All you need to do is have a conversation with the client about what their anticipated income is going to be, and then figure out what kind of written documentation you can get of that anticipated income. Okay. We're not quite done. We have figured out 30% of adjusted income and 10% of gross income when we picked our rent standard. But we now have to take into account that HUD is interested in the total cost of housing, which includes utilities. So step 9 is determining what utility allowance may be necessary for your client. Utility allowance rules actually apply to all clients, to all project types, including rapid rehousing projects, and including leasing projects that choose not to require participants to pay rent or an occupancy charge. So for every client that you serve, you're looking at the local housing authority's schedule of utility allowances, which will show you what the reasonable expected monthly utility consumption amount is based on the unit size and the types of utilities that the client is paying outside of their rent. If the utility is included in rent, that's already covered in your rent calculation and you don't need to worry about it. But any utility that is on this schedule of utility allowances that the client is paying outside of the rent, you need to check the utility allowance schedule and figure out what the utility allowance for that household is. And then you're going to use that to adjust how much rent the client is paying. So that means either you take the total cost, the total client contribution of rent and subtract the utility allowance, or if the client is not paying any rent, if their client contribution is 0, or if your client contribution is less than what the utility allowance is going to be, right? So if you take the client portion of rent and you subtract the utility allowance and you get a negative number, you're going to make a direct payment to the client. So in some cases, you're going to be paying the client for that utility allowance rather than just deducting it from the amount of rent that they're going to be paying. And now we have done our full overview of client contribution to rent. I know that there are probably questions about that. I want to move on because there are a couple other topics that are very important for us to touch on, but feel free to put your questions about this in the chat and I can keep answering them in the chat as Nicole continues with the next portion of the presentation.
Thanks, Eli. So while we're monitoring the chat, I will be now moving on and covering housing quality standard inspections. Can we advance the slide, Eli? Thanks. And ensuring that CoC funded housing in Santa Clara County meets federal standards. So starting off with some background on HQS and other regulations. Next slide, please. HUD has not created a CoC specific HQS inspection form. So CoC funded programs generally borrow from HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Programs HQS. And HCV's HQS was established in 1974, and it has not been updated since. And these housing quality standards are intentionally vague because they are meant to be national regulations, and they have to cover a lot of different types of housing stocks. So these standards can be both under and over inclusive. So for example, there's no carbon monoxide detector requirement in HQS, but that's a Santa Clara County requirement. So where they're under inclusive, to fill in those blanks, you're going to want to look to local and state laws and codes and the Housing Authority's administrative plan in some instances. And you'll want to be especially familiar with safety related local laws pertaining to lead-based paint safety, fire codes, carbon monoxide detectors, and water and air temperature standards. Where there is a discrepancy between local laws and HQS, and they have to do with safety, please use whichever is the stricter requirement. Next slide, please. The CSC program, the CSC interim rule requires HQS inspections of all units receiving leasing dollars and rental assistance through the CSC program. Units need to be inspected prior to move-in and annually thereafter. Subsidies won't be paid for housing that fails HQS unless the owner corrects any deficiencies within 30 days from the date of the initial inspection, and the program verifies that all deficiencies have been corrected. And we want to note that these requirements are critical. Programs can lose funding if not in compliance. So programs must maintain HQS inspections for 5 years to demonstrate compliance. We recommend keeping lead-based paint records indefinitely to show due diligence in the event that there's a lead-based paint issue later on. And record keeping is vital. If you cannot show HUD that you conducted inspections, they didn't happen in HUD's eyes. So why are HQS inspections important? Well, they promote access to safe, suitable housing regardless of income level, because people should not have to suffer in substandard housing due to their income. Also, having to pass inspections incentivize landlords to provide better housing for everyone. Inadequate housing is also a public health issue. It can lead to increased asthma, lead paint poisoning, and other environmental health issues. HUD wants people to be able to choose where they live while still ensuring there's a standard and a way to inspect that units are habitable. And we want to note that these standards are a floor, not a ceiling. They're intended to create a baseline, but not to create unreasonable standards that would limit the available housing stock. HQS standards, again, are general and vague, so they'll often be left to our discretion and judgment. And if it's not a matter of safety, then tenant preference rules. You really want to respect the individual's self-determination. In certain instances, HUD may be able to provide a waiver if there's a situation in which a unit would fail, but for a reason that's related to tenant preference, so like a neighborhood. And in those instances, you may be able to seek a waiver by going to the local field office. So for now, this training, we're really focusing on private units. We'll describe the different requirements for other types of housing, such as SROs and shared housing, a bit later. But the general requirements are that every unit has a living room, a bathroom, and a kitchen. Studio apartments count as having a living room. And per the CoC interim rule, units must have at least one bedroom or sleeping room for every 2 people, although HUD may sometimes grant waivers in high density areas. And you cannot require older children of the opposite sex to share sleeping rooms. So it doesn't matter where people are actually sleeping. So they can be all in the same room if that's what they want, but there needs to be sufficient space for them to sleep in 2 different areas if that's desired. And in general, room size is a matter of tenant preference. So again, we're going through this very quickly, and HQS can be incredibly technical. There's a lot of detail. We could dedicate an entire training to this. We do dedicate an entire training to this topic. I encourage you to reference the training materials that we have put on in the past. They're on the CoC website. They're led by our in-house HQS experts, so they're really great. But for now, we're just going to be providing a very high-level overview in the next slide. So each room used for living must have adequate illumination. So here you're checking for either adequate natural or artificial lighting. With electricity, you're making sure that outlets are working. You're concerned about potential electric hazards and fires. So are there exposed or frayed wires? Are there improper connections? You're checking for overloading capacity. With windows and safety, windows must be able to keep the elements out. Screens aren't necessary, but windows must be lockable and not have missing or broken panes. Bedrooms need to have a window that's openable if it's designed to do so. Kitchen and bathrooms don't need windows, they just need proper ventilation. And windows leading to fire escapes cannot be nailed shut. With ceilings, walls, and floors, minor scratches, worn floors, those things are fine. Here you're looking for serious structural issues that could lead to collapse. So you're looking for buckling and large holes or dangers of falling materials. With lead-based paint, this is another topic that we have an entire training dedicated towards, but very briefly, lead was commonly used in paint to make surfaces stronger and easier to clean. But in 1978, the federal government banned consumer use of paint that contains lead. So most homes constructed before 1978 do have lead paint, and deteriorated surfaces can lead to children being exposed to lead dust. And when children 6 years and younger are exposed to lead-based paint, this can lead to serious developmental delays and behavioral issues. So if a unit is built prior to 1978, before execution of the lease, the owner, in the case that it's a rental assistance unit, or the program if it's a leased unit, are required to disclose knowledge of lead-based paint in housing to all prospective residents. And in the instance that a family with a child under the age of 6 will reside in the unit, a visual assessment of all surfaces must be conducted. And here you're looking for peeling, chipping, cracking, and chalking of paint, which can often be caused by moisture or poor surface preparation. Again, I know that was very quick, but we really encourage you to look at our lead-based paint training materials for further detail. And we'll just end that piece by noting that if affected units are more than 20 square feet on the exterior or more than 2 square feet on the interior, then a certified inspector must clear the unit. Next slide, please. So some general health and safety tips. Exterior doors leading to common hallways must be lockable. A chain lock would fail inspection if it was a chain lock only. It's really best practice not to have double key deadbolt locks in case of fire issues. And you must be able to use and access the unit without having to go through other properties. And in case of fires, the building must have an alternative exit, such as fire stairs or windows with a ladder. Next slide, please. I also want to note that smoke detectors must be on each level of dwellings, and elevators must work if they're present, and interior stairs in a common with the interior stairs and common hall, you want to check that they're free of hazards. So you're looking for loose, broken, or missing steps. Next slide, please. Some other issues you're looking for. You're checking for evidence of infestation. So you're checking for droppings, gnaw marks. HUD doesn't explicitly address bed bugs, but that's likely a fail in inspection. With garbage and debris, you're just making sure that there aren't large piles of garbage inside or outside of the unit. You're looking for proper coverings and lids for disposal dumpsters and the like. You're checking interior air quality, so you're checking for gas, mold, pollutants. And overall, you're looking at site and neighborhood conditions, confirming general safety and the habitability of the area. So you're checking for flooding, poor drainage, sewer hazards, and the like. Next slide, please. So HQS does apply to what HUD defines as special housing types. We're going to cover some of the special requirements for the first two on this list specifically. So with shared housing, that's a building occupied by 2 or more families with a private space for the family and shared common areas. And then we have SROs, which are those single room occupancy, the private living and sleeping space with a shared bathroom or kitchen, and it can only be occupied by 1 person. Next slide, please. So with SROs, this must be at least 110 square feet with at least 4 square feet of closet space. It must be accessible without going through another unit. We must have 2 or more means of exiting the building, and exterior doors and windows must also be lockable. Buildings must have a sprinkler system and smoke detector, and for shared bathrooms, there must be at least 1 toilet, sink, and bath or shower per 6 people, and the bathroom must not be located more than 1 floor above or below the SRO unit. Lead-based paint requirements do not apply to the SRO housing types. We'll now move to shared housing. Next slide, please. So these units must have 1 bedroom per 2 people, and the unit must have adequate space and security, which I recognize is vague, but again, a lot of this is going to be down to your best judgment and discretion. And it must have access to shared or private kitchen and bathroom. Okay, we're going to wrap this up with some tips. Again, I know this was very quick. We can use these annual inspections as a selling point to landlords. You can say this is an opportunity to make sure the apartment remains in good condition and to catch any issues. Property owners generally want to maintain their properties and make sure that they're in good working order. You can use minor issues with the unit as a bargaining chip to lower rent. So you can look at things like scuffed floors or other wear and tear that aren't safety hazards and leverage that to lower the rent. And again, we just want to know HQS can be incredibly technical. So when in doubt, please do feel free to consult a supervisor or an expert. You may want to reach out to someone at your agency who's conducted quite a few HQS inspections, or you're always welcome to reach out to us. And lastly, when thinking about annual inspections, you want to speak with the tenant in advance about any issues to be prepared. And just remember that you're entering someone's house and where they live. And that they may feel uncomfortable or as though that their house is being judged. So we want to be really mindful and gentle with that. But just for the sake of time, I'm going to hand it over to Eli now for the final section.
Thanks, Nicole. And just to say it one more time, we know that this is a lot. There's a lot of compliance requirements. And again, in our follow-up email to this, we hope that you really take a look at that, because there will be additional resources about a lot of this. So for example, the link to the full HQS training that Nicole mentioned. And then this slide also links to some other resources you might find useful. So the last topic we have for today has to do with lease requirements, meaning what has to be in your lease or the client's lease. So very briefly, leases can work a little bit different for leasing projects versus rental assistance projects. So in a leasing project with leasing funds, the primary lease and the primary tenant is actually the program, the recipient or subrecipient of the funds. That's you, the program. And you'll use your leasing funds to lease a unit from the landowner. And then the participant is going to have what we call a sublease or potentially an occupancy agreement. Right? And the requirements for transitional housing are that the client's sublease or occupancy agreement be at least 1 month, and that it is automatically renewable after that month. Usually up to 24 months, because that's the length of time that you can provide rental leasing assistance for a transitional housing client. For permanent housing projects that are leasing, that sublease must be a sublease. It can't be an occupancy agreement for permanent housing. And it has to be for a term of at least 1 year. So you can't have an initial term that's only 6 months. It has to be at least 1 year. And again, has to be automatically renewable. Rental assistance projects, particularly tenant-based and project-based rental assistance with CoC funding, are a little bit different. So you, the program, the recipient or subrecipient of the grant, has an agreement with the landowner, but you're not a master leasing the units. You don't have an actual lease for the units. It's the program participant who directly enters into a lease with the landowner. They are the tenant for that unit with all of the rights and responsibilities that apply. This applies to every CoC rental assistance tenant. They have to have a lease. For transitional housing projects, again, very similarly, that lease has to be for at least 1 month, and it has to be automatically renewable upon when it ends, after that first month ends. And for permanent housing, again, very similar, has to be for a term of at least 1 year, and it has to be automatically renewable. This applies also to rapid rehousing projects. A rapid rehousing project has rental assistance funding, and any client in a rapid rehousing project has to start out when they find a unit, they have to have a lease that is at least 12 months long. Regardless of how long you expect to provide rental assistance for that client, their lease with the landlord needs to start out with an initial term of 1 year. I also want to spend a little time clarifying what automatically renewable upon expiration means, because this is something that we often see when we're looking at client files is not compliant in some of the leases that folks are signing. So automatically renewable means when the initial term ends, that lease will continue just by default, unless the tenant says, I want to move out, or unless the landlord says, we're ending this lease, you're going to move out, right? Unless there's, and in different places, that might mean they have to have just cause to evict the client. There's a lot tied up in those tenancy rights. But in terms of looking at the lease, you want to make sure that it doesn't say at the end, the initial term begins on X date, and the initial term is for 1 year, and the lease can renew, on the agreement of the landlord and the client or the tenant, right? If it says the landlord has to agree for the lease to renew, or if it says the tenant has to indicate they want the lease to renew, if there's any action that anybody has to take in order for that lease to renew, it's not automatically renewable. And I'm getting some great questions. So automatic renewable, is that the same as month to month after the year lease is done? Definitely related. So the lease can become month to month. That's totally okay. It can't be week to week, which is not standard practice, so that's fine. But it can renew as month to month after that initial term is over. That's absolutely right. The thing about the meaning of the word automatic, though, is that there's no trigger, right? There's no step that needs to be taken. It's just going to immediately by default go to month, even if the tenant and the landlord completely forget about the lease ending, right? So yeah, looking for language that contradicts that in the lease is a really important step when you're reviewing the lease before the client signs it. Because if that's not in there, you're going to have to have the landlord change it, or you're not able to assist the unit. And then the last bit of lease requirements we want to touch on is some specific lease requirements that come with the Violence Against Women Act. So VAWA has provisions that apply to our CoC funded programs. We're not going to go into great depth about these VAWA provisions. What we're going to do is point you to a full VAWA training that is recorded and on the CoC website. So that's one of those very important things that you want to look for in our follow-up email. There are a few things that you'll see. The first is every program needs to be providing certain notices to every client in your CoC funded PSH, rapid rehousing, or transitional housing. This is because we don't know when a client is going to experience an incident of violence that qualifies them for these rights and protections. And so we want to make sure that at the beginning of their participation, they understand what those rights and protections are in case they have an experience that they need to move, or their household becomes unsafe. So there are two things: a notice of occupancy rights and a certification form that need to be provided to every client. And there are also a set of terms, a set of things that must be in our leases. So if it's a leasing program and the program has a lease with the landlord, there are required terms that have to go in that lease, and you really can't assist the unit if you can't put those in the lease. If a participant has a lease with a landlord, so rental assistance project, there are particular terms that have to go into that lease, and if they're not in there, you can't assist that unit. There are also, if you have a sublease with the participant, you need to make sure that your sublease with the participant has these provisions in it. So we strongly encourage you to go to that larger VAWA training. There's a lot of important stuff here, and there are compliance requirements, and we do have a full training that's recorded that you all can view and should view on your own schedule. And with that, we have covered all of our highlighted housing-related compliance topics.